This may come as a surprise to some of my viewers, gay or non-gay, but the word homosexual didn't even appear in the Bible until 1946. So this is the 70th anniversary of the first time that very potent word was put into Christian scripture. Our next guest knows all about it. Welcome the Reverend Justin Cannon from All Saints Episcopal Church, San Leandro.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So you are the author of two books that have become, well, quite important in the debate, The Bible, Christianity, and Homosexuality in 2005, correct?
Yes.
And then also an anthology of poetry by LGBT Christians, Sanctified.
Yep. I'm the editor of that
the
one,
editor.
actually.
Oh,
There's
okay,
a number
right.
of poets who contributed to that.
But before we get into the discussion of when the word homosexuality made it into the Bible, let me ask you kind of a two-part question. When did you realize you were a Christian, and when did you realize you were gay, and which came first?
Okay. So I grew up in the Episcopal Church, actually. I was lucky to grow up in a church that eventually became very LGBT friendly. I grew up in Detroit in the inner city and was very active in the church. My mom helped start the food pantry at the church. My dad was very active with a housing initiative the church launched. And it wasn't until, I probably should have known in middle school as hormones were setting in and I was kind of looking at other boys, but it didn't really register until sometime in high school. I accepted in my mind the idea that I might be bi. It really wasn't until my first year of college that I admitted to myself that I was gay. There's a story behind that if you want to hear it.
Yeah, please.
Well, it was Earlham College where I did my undergraduate, and it was National Coming Out Day.
October 11th.
Yeah, or maybe it was Pride Month or something. I think it was June. And there were sidewalk chalk at the college, things like 2468, don't assume your grandma's straight, and stuff like that. And a student had written a letter to the editor of the school paper condemning homosexuality, citing Leviticus in the Bible. And I found myself, as a religion student there, responding to that. And while I was writing that, there was a moment of admitting to myself, I wasn't just defending my friends, I was defending myself.
Right.
So that was my first year of college.
So in a sense, in that epiphany, as it were, admitting to being a gay Christian in one moment. You know, I noticed this on the cover of your book. 100 years ago, of course, was the first time we really started talking about homosexuality. There wasn't a word for it in the ancient scriptures, and the first time the word homosexuality appeared in the Bible was in 1946, 70 years ago. Talk to me about that and why that's significant.
Sure. Well, it's significant because anytime you open a Bible and there is the word homosexual, that is a lie. That is a deception. That is, I would say, a perversion of the scriptures. That word homosexual is a mixture of Greek and Latin. Homo coming from Greek, meaning same, and sexual coming from Latin sexualis. So about 100 years ago, these terms were mushed together to come up with this idea that we know of. When you look at the ancient languages of the scriptures, they're talking about things very different than sexual orientation. Usually situations of sexual abuse. All of the scriptures that have been used to condemn gay people or the LGBT community are abusive, exploitative, reducing people to objects rather than relational and consensual.
Do you think, as someone who obviously has written about this and become an international expert in the field, that some of what was written about as quote-unquote homosexuality in the Bible was gender neutral or was actually heterosexuality and it's just been kind of labeled gay for religious or political purposes?
No, and we could look at the scriptures a little. I could do maybe 5-minute overview of Leviticus, Timothy, Romans, Corinthians, that they do have to do with same-sex sexual activity, but for example, there was a practice of temple prostitution where young, effeminate boys, pretty much, would be prostituted out in the ancient world. This is Old Testament, so we're talking thousands of years ago. So Leviticus, if you really study it, is talking about that practice of men sleeping with these young temple prostitutes who would have been male. But condemning that context and then applying that to today, a loving, committed couple, or even two people who are, in a consensual, co-equal relationship.
Right.
It's a whole different dynamic.
And what about the New Testament, which seems to be the focus of a lot of anti-gay rhetoric from, quote unquote, Christians?
Sure. So much of the New Testament centers around one word that St. Paul uses. If I try and pronounce it, I'll slaughter it. It's arsenokoitai, is my poor Greek. And
Brava.
Paul actually made up this word. It didn't exist before Paul. Only reference to it after is quoting him. He was trying to get at an idea. And in my studies, as I've kind of unraveled that term, it really, to me, points back again to that prostitution. Every time he uses that word in 1 Corinthians and 1 Timothy, it's followed by a word for male prostitutes.
It's interesting because Paul has come down to a lot of people as the quote-unquote homophobic Christian, or the homophobic teller of the gospel. My husband, for instance, at our wedding 18 years ago, what we consider our wedding, and now had 2 more since, he refused to have that very famous section from Paul about love. He's like, I'm sorry, I'm not having Paul in my wedding ceremony. Is that fair to Paul?
I don't think so. Paul's actually been very misjudged, misrepresented, and as he's been represented as misogynistic, homophobic, rigid, all sorts of ways that I think are entirely unfair.
Right. Is it fair for any of us in the 21st century to put any sort of overlay of modern sexuality or gender identification on the people in the Bible from 2,000 years ago?
Oh, not at all. I mean, they had no...
I'm not defending them, I'm just trying to...
They didn't have the same understanding of sexual orientation that we have. So when you're looking at a scripture or some ancient saints talking about same-sex activity, you have to look at the context in which they're seeing that.
Right. So as an openly gay man, a rector in the Episcopal Church, certainly one of the more forward-thinking, if not the most forward-thinking Christian denomination, are you more of a 21st century Christian or more of a first century Christian?
That's a really good question. I don't even know how to answer that. I like to think I'm an amalgam of both, because I really do take the early church as a model for faith, because there was a real fire that motivated that community. The Christians in that first century were under persecution until Constantine and the empire approved of Christianity. So they were living this faith, risking their lives for it.
Right.
And to me, there's something beautiful in that model. Today, what risk is there in America saying you're Christian?
Right. Well, I mean, it depends. I mean, I've often said, even on this show, because I have members of the faith community on a good deal, because I think it's one of the things in the LGBT community we're least likely to talk about. We'll talk about sex, but we won't talk about faith. And people have said, what do you think of Christianity? And I always say, well, I think we should try it. Do you think that the current Christian denominations that call themselves evangelical or born again truly understand what it is to be Christian?
That's another good question. I like where you're going. Being Christian isn't just liking Jesus or thinking he's cool. That Christianity is a very ancient faith, that it is something. It's not up to you and me to make up what we want Christianity to be. So those from more Catholic, Anglican, Episcopal background speak of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. That this is something that spans through time.
Which doesn't necessarily mean the Roman Church.
It doesn't mean the Roman Church. It doesn't mean Roman Catholic.
Right.
Catholic means universal. It comes, kataholos is the Greek. The church according to the whole. So we see this church as something ancient, something that spans through time, and many of these churches, evangelical, Pentecostal, they're not really connected to that ancient faith in many ways. They've taken a piece of it and gone to town with it.
There's a meme on, or a meme, however you pronounce it, I just see them, on Facebook now that's going around, and it talks about David and Jonathan in the Old Testament. I don't know if you've seen it. And there's this wonderful kind of homoerotic drawing of King David, kind of shirtless, of course, really pumped from the gym, I guess, in Damascus or something. And there's Jonathan behind him leaning over, and it takes the quotes from the Bible. Jonathan took his clothes off in front of David, and David loved Jonathan more than women, and David and Jonathan kissed. And obviously this is a quote-unquote pro-gay post, making the connection that, well, there was homosexuality in the Bible. So that's the flip side of that. What would you say to someone who's posting that? Are they accurate, or are they also getting it wrong?
So I actually do talks around the country. I'll be in Washington next month, and part of my talk is not just unraveling the scriptures that have been used against LGBT people, but showing that there are positive affirmations of LGBT people in the scriptures. That while they didn't have the full understanding of sexual orientation that we have today, in the Greco-Roman world, it was common for there to be not just exploitative same-sex activity, but same-sex love. I mean, men have fallen in love with men and women with women for as long as people have had, you know, these attractions. So there would have been gay couples. They wouldn't have understood that in the same scientific way.
But would they have been condemned? I mean, I guess two-part question. Do you think David and Jonathan were lovers, and what would people have thought about the king of Israel and his best friend bedding it, you know, down together?
It's clear that there is an intimacy between the two. It's not clear whether that was sexual in nature. So it could go either way. There are scriptures that point to David and Jonathan and the love between them. Which is it? One of them David writes a psalm, you know, speaking of the love of Jonathan better than the love of women. And that word for love is the same term in Hebrew that's used in the Song of Songs by Solomon.
Which of course is incredibly erotic, heterosexual love.
So there's clearly an eros to their love.
Right.
Whether it manifests in sex, we don't know, but there are other incidences like that in the scripture of same-gender affection.
But would they have been condemned for it in that period, in your experience?
I would say no. There was a lot more openness. Even in the early centuries of Christianity, there was a lot of diversity of how same-gendered couples were treated. In Spain, even, same-sex marriage in the early centuries was tolerated by the Visigoth. And it's fascinating to delve into the history. John Boswell, have you come across his works? Of
course. His Homosexuality, Christianity, and Myth, I believe is the title, or something like that.
And Social Tolerance. And he researched Vatican archives and found actual liturgies of same-gender.
Yeah, we actually used part of it in our marriage that he had unearthed. Nice. We've only got about a minute left, but I'd like to have you talk to me about what is it like being an openly gay priest, an openly gay rector in 2016. You know, I think everyone thought last year, after quote-unquote marriage equality was the law of the land, that it was just going to be all happy and we were all going to skip off into the gay sunset. But now we've got Congress voting just in the last week to repeal or not go forward with gay rights legislation. There's bills in North Carolina and other southern states. Are we taking 3 steps forward and 2 steps back? And what is your place in the church? How hard is it being a gay person of faith?
I think it's kind of like a waltz more than steps forward and back, you know, 1 step forward, 1 step left. It's a dance that we're as a nation engaged in, slowly kind of sorting out this issue. So it's by no means done. There's still a lot of work to be done. For me, being a gay rector, you know, I'm a rector who happens to be gay. That really doesn't manifest itself in my congregation very much. But in my other work with my books, my advocacy, the talks I do around the nation, I get, you know, a bunch of people writing me each month thanking me for my work. I also get death threats and people trying to tarnish my image.
You still get death threats?
I've had one recently. FBI even researched one once.
You're smiling about it though, but it must kind of be a little disconcerting.
I don't know. It's kind of funny to me that people are so threatened by me, because it's like, I don't know, why do I scare you? Because, you know, people must be scared if they're threatening you.
Well, that's the Christian way to look at it.
I guess.
Thank you, Reverend. It was wonderful having you on. We hope to have you on again.
I would love that.
Next up, our conversation with Gail Roberts, talking to us about Open House, the place in San Francisco for the gay and gray. We'll be right back.